The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. It is one of the most coveted trophies in the world, but are gold medals really gold? Well, mostly, they're not. The gold medals given out these days are nearly entirely silver and are plated with pure gold to give them that iconic sheen. Silver medals are, of course, made with silver, and bronze medals are a combination of copper and other metals like tin or zinc. And while winning an Olympic medal is priceless, the value of the materials in the medal are not. In recent games, some of the materials used to make the medals have come from recycled cell phones. Mass Mutual celebrates women's sports history and understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
Nigel Mansell and McLaren, two of the great names of Formula One in the 1980s and 1990s, finally joined forces in 1995. But it was a marriage that was doomed from the start and only lasted 2 races. Welcome to the latest episode of Bring Back V10s, brought to you by therace.com, where we take a look back at a golden and noisy era of Formula One. As always, you can get in touch with us through our social media channels using @WeAreTheRace and the hashtag BringBackV10s. And remember, we want to hear your comments and questions for our final episode of the series, where we'll be answering all of your questions about this era from 1989 to 2005, the V10 era, if you will. On this episode, we're looking back then at why things went so badly wrong and so quickly for Mansell and McLaren, and joining me to look back at one of the more bizarre high-profile driver and team combinations are Sam Smith and Jack Benyon, both making their first appearance on the podcast. Gents, welcome, and as always, we've got our traditional opening question, which we'll throw to you first, Sam. When you think Mansell and McLaren 1995, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Surrealness, I think. I think just the unlikeliness of Mansell driving for McLaren. Simple as that.
Yeah. Somehow that crash helmet didn't look right in Marlborough colours, I think we could say. What about you, Jack?
I think sadness is the word. It's just such a, two giants of the sport that should have come together and created such a fantastic story. And obviously it, as I'm sure we'll discuss on this podcast, didn't quite work out as planned.
Yeah, and as we say, bizarre and an unexpected alliance, really. So how did it form? Because obviously at the end of 1994, Mansell had done a clutch of races for Williams. He'd won his last race for Williams at Adelaide. And following the 4 races he did in 94, he was hoping to get a Williams drive for 1995, but Williams didn't take up that option. And I think they actually had to pay Mansell some money to not do that. We won't spend too long on the Mansell-Williams saga because that will get an episode of its own in the future. But Mansell was disappointed to miss out on the drive. And in one of his many books, he talks about the fact that he found out a day in advance of Williams telling him, because he found out through the media, which he wasn't happy about, and he didn't get a proper explanation from the team. So his assumption to this day is that Williams chose youth over experience because they didn't have to pay David Coulthard as much money as they'd have to pay him. Jack, looking back now, do we think, given how strong Mansell had finished 94 with Williams, did they make the right decision to go for Coulthard, or was that a surprise perhaps?
I think that's the key, isn't it? He had such a strong end to 1994 that I think probably most people at the time just assumed that they were going to stick with Mansell and go with him. And I think it was a bit of a surprise that they didn't. But, Hill maybe could have done with a more plug-in and play option alongside him in that 1995 campaign. But also, I don't think Coulthard did a particularly bad job. Obviously, both cars had retirements that year, and Coulthard did have one more. But, I think the decision for Williams was a difficult one, and I think youth over experience is definitely one way of putting it, isn't it? But I think money played a big factor in it as well, and the fact that Williams still had to pay Mansell, according to Mansell's book, they still had to pay him that money even though he'd left the team, is a bit of a surprise. And I think it's difficult to work out the finances all of the finances involved at this point, because it all seems a bit cloak and dagger, even looking back now and still having the benefit of Mansell's book and stuff like that as well. So it's a bit of just a bizarre situation. Looking back at it in hindsight, I think Coulthard did a good job, and but going back to actually making that decision in 1994, for me, a bit of a surprise. And Williams saw what they were getting at the end of 1994, and I thought that the decision there would be to go with him in 1995 as well.
Yeah, it looked like he'd done all he could really to justify that seat. And you have to wonder, the 95 Williams was a good car, and it'd be very interesting to see what Mansell on form could have done with it. But not long after he loses that Williams opportunity, Ron Dennis calls him and suggests they get together for a chat. And Mansell says in his book that the meetings were a case of Ron motivating me, saying that McLaren would be capable of winning races and talking up the partnership with Mercedes. Word gets out quickly, as it always does in Formula One, that Mansell's been visiting McLaren. And in the media, there's a lot of doubt being expressed by the journalists that, is Mansell and McLaren really a compatible partnership? And Autosport pulls out a line from a year previously when Ron Dennis had said he can't work with drivers he doesn't understand, and he said he's never understood Mansell. When the deal gets announced, Dennis says, "We are very different characters, and a lot of people were aware of the opinions I've expressed of Mansell in the past." He even says that the first meeting was, quote, nearly catastrophic, and Mansell supports that as well. Mansell says, "Negotiations over the deal began badly. It took several meetings before we both began to see that there was more to each other than we had thought. Once we started sharing our personal attitudes to racing, we found we had a lot in common. From then on, the dialogue was relatively smooth, and we quickly arrived at a deal for 95. But Sam, Mansell and Ron Dennis, two huge characters of Formula One history, but it never felt like a good fit, did it? Do you think this relationship ultimately was cursed from the beginning?
Two big characters, two big egos there, aren't there? I mean, the assumption is that they would clash. But actually, when you listen to Ron's words, and they did seem to get more of a relationship as they went on, you think actually, they did have quite a bit in common. They was both self-made men. They were both quite abrasive characters. They knew what they wanted. So in a professional sense, they probably were similar. But you can often get too similar as well, can't you? So who knows where that went? I mean, they will have come across each other way back from 1980 when they were both doing Formula 2, Mansell racing, and obviously Ron doing the Project 4 stuff then. So they will have known of each other for a long time. But was it doomed? I would say that, even with hindsight, you would say that it seemed to be working to some extent from a personal point of view. But, 50% probably was just down to Mansell not having the appetite to go again in Formula One at the age of 41, and probably McLaren been in that turmoil and transition. So when those things met, it possibly was doomed, yes.
And it's in early February that Mansell is officially unveiled as a McLaren driver with a press conference, and it is a one-year deal. Mansell says he wanted an option for a further 2, but the agreement is that if 95 is going well, there'll be no reason to make a change, and they'll extend it anyway. Ron makes a joke that it's a one-year deal to keep Mansell on his toes, which I imagine Nigel appreciated. And at the press conference, Mansell says, "It's not a question of will we win this year, but when. With the might of Mercedes, the organisational prowess of McLaren, I'm feeling extremely confident. I've looked at the car, and if it works as well as it looks, it'll be fabulous." Now, that final comment is one we will come back to, because he says something similar at the launch as well. And Dennis is quite open at the announcement and says Nigel has a degree of explosive nature about him, and probably he'll lose control a couple of times, which is very counterproductive from an emotional standpoint. I expect it, and it will be understandable because, as with all teams, I think we're going to be on for the odd disappointment. Some curious quotes there from Ron, plenty of Ron speak as well, so many syllables per word. Mansell says, looking back, that before the car had even launched, he realised McLaren was starting to lose its way, technically, and he says, "I had never understood why Ayrton Senna left McLaren at the end of 1993, but as my experience of them developed, I realised that he had left because he had seen that technically the team was in decline. It was tough for me to find all of this out the way I did." McLaren joined up with Mercedes for 95, which for what would become a very successful partnership. And in 94, as I'm sure we'll talk about in future episodes, they had a disastrous Peugeot-powered season and their first year post-Senna. 94, though, was McLaren's first winless season since 1980. Jack, do you think by then we were already aware how far the McLaren star had fallen by this point?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I think in terms of the sort of literal sense of your question, it's easy for us to look back in hindsight now and talk about the position that McLaren were in at that point. But at the time, I don't think people knew quite how bad the situation was. And that's quite often the case in Formula One, and specifically around that time as well, with so many rule changes going on, so many teams moving around. Every year there'd be a new car, and quite often the top team stayed on top, but there was so much movement around that kind of midfield and the back of the grid, teams dropping out, things that we just don't get in modern Formula One anymore. We look at how bad McLaren were in 2018 compared to how good they were in 2019. Back then it was much more movable. You could, if you got everything right in the off season, then you could come and be immediately competitive the next season, where that's much more difficult to do now. But yeah, I think at that point it was obviously a team lacking direction. Whether that's, I don't think it's fair to specifically direct that at Ron Dennis. I think I think when we say lack of direction there, we're referring to all of the departments and everything pulling together in the right direction. But also, 4 engine partners in 4 years. I think it was a massive misjudgment for Ron and Nigel to be claiming that they were going to be fighting for a championship that year straight away, because anyone who looks at the kind of situation that they had there on a piece of paper, if you were to write for and against fighting for a championship and you stack those up for and against for McLaren in 95, I think any sane person looking back now would go, that's going to be an against, and they're going to struggle to fight with the likes of Benetton and Williams. So, I think it's one of those things that you can get caught up in a bubble in Formula One, can't you? And the current news can sway you quite significantly. And when Ron Dennis starts a season and says, we're going to be fighting for a championship, and he's just signed Nigel Mansell, who's one of the most popular drivers in Formula One, and he's also saying that they're going to fight for a championship, then it's very easy to be drawn into that rhetoric and to believe it as well. And I think that was probably a case of what happened with McLaren. And as we saw over the next couple of seasons, really, or at least including 95 and 96, that wasn't to be the case. But it was the start of something a lot more special for the team. It just wasn't going to happen overnight. It wasn't one of those sort of periods I discussed earlier where like you have a really good winter and you bring in some new people and there's a new direction and you sort of hit everything and you hit the ground running the next year. It just wasn't to be for McLaren that year.
What do you think, Sam? Were McLaren in the doldrums by this point, or was it clear that they were?
I'm not sure if it was absolutely clear, and actually I'm going to slightly disagree with Jack in terms of Ron's culpability in this, because recently I watched the 1993 BBC documentary, A Season with McLaren, which I think is one of the
brilliant.
It's a superb documentary, and if you haven't seen it, yeah, check it out on YouTube. Some remarkable scenes in it, and some of those are of a McLaren-clad strutting peacock of Ron Dennis, basically just being Ron. I mean, you can call it confidence, you can call it arrogance, whatever you want to call it. I mean, in '93. They were punching above their weight, obviously, with the engine power that they had, and they had one of their major assets, of course, with Senna. I actually think Ron probably just generally underestimated what losing Senna meant at the end of '93, and I think he went through those relationships, the brief one with Chrysler, the sort of testing phase, and then with Peugeot. That's all well documented, but I think if you walked the walk like Ron did with that strand of arrogance, then you had to back it up at the end of the day when you were in the doldrums. And whether they knew it or not, something tells me that inherent confidence of Ron probably masked the fact that McLaren were not in a great place. And that we saw that borne out really in quite painful terms for them throughout 1995. And let's not forget as well that it was really probably the Mansell episode which put a lot of questions in Marlborough's mind as well, and then Marlborough essentially left, I think, in early '96. It wasn't communicated until August, but it was done, I think, at the Spanish Grand Prix. But typical Ron, he came back, he had a plan B with West and spiriting Newey away from Williams as well. But ultimately, I think, as a figurehead of the company, as somebody of Ron's personality, then whether he would admit it now, something tells me he probably wouldn't. But he has to take some blame for those fallow years for sure.
The MP410, which is the car in question here, launches in the middle of February, and it's revealed with a new wing attached to the top of the engine cover. For those of you that haven't seen it, consider it a more offensive-looking version of the T-wings we saw in F1 a few years ago. But Ron is very proud of the design, as you can imagine. He dismisses any doubts about its legality, and at launch he says, "The regulations are very clear. I don't think there is any greyness about that area. To optimise such a small aerodynamic device, you have to get it in the absolute perfect position. What we've tried to do is not just conform to the regulations, but also develop a car that explores to the full what's left within them. What you are seeing is one of the many, many variants we developed." And Mansell at the launch says, once again, if it goes as quick as it looks, then everybody had better watch out. I said we'd come back to that comment because he mentioned it before the car was launched as well. Sam, if it goes as quick as it looks, I think it did go as quick as it looked because it looked horrible.
So I tend to agree, and somebody else who actually agreed with that is a guy called Colin Morgan, who I've known for many years, but he was one of the mechanics who worked on Mansell seat fittings actually, and he had some pretty sharp opinions actually about the whole disaster that unfolded. But one of the things that stuck out in my mind was that he described the car as a complete pig in terms of how it looked and how it performed. So there's no shying away from the fact that people actually working on it didn't have the greatest opinion of the aesthetics of the car, and as Murray Walker would say, it was a masterpiece of understatement when it came to sort of summarising the way that it looked. It was angular. It just looks wrong on every kind of level, every angle. And it kind of gave off this, I suppose, slightly psychotic character in the way that it handled as well. It had major pitch sensitivity issues. It just wouldn't drive from the front, and that's something which Mansell, whatever his motivation was, just couldn't deal with. And I suppose as well, you've got to stack it up against some of the really attractive cars that McLaren did. I mean, the MP49, I thought in '94, which was the 10 was essentially a carryover from many components. It was a reasonably good-looking car. The '93 car was pretty tasty as well. I think the '95 car just suffered a bit because the ugly duckling sort of came from that lineage of swans, I guess. I think ultimately in '95 a lot of cars aesthetically went up against Barnard's Ferrari, didn't they? And there was no chance of ever coming away with anything other than a bad reflection when you stacked up against that, because it was just a gorgeous car. But I mean, on all fronts, it just wasn't a good proposition at all.
What do you think, Jack? We can look back at, as Sam mentioned there, some gorgeous 1990s cars, especially in the early part and the middle of the decade, but this was not one of them.
It wasn't a particularly good-looking car. I do have a little bit of a thing for the cars that push the boundaries, and even if they don't get it right, like the Eiffel Type 21, for example, that weird wing on the centre of the front. I think it's just maybe because I'm a bit of a deviant, but I don't think the '95 car is as bad as some people. I think pigs are pretty harsh, but yeah, I don't think it's definitely. Not of the ilk of the Barnard Ferrari for sure. Sam's definitely right on that one. And no matter how you look at the sort of extra wing and the extra sort of aero that they tried to put on that car, it definitely wasn't the best looking car on the grid, and it definitely behaved as much. Mansell was bang on. There's not many quotes, I think, that you can look back on that year where you think I'm getting the whole truth and nothing but the truth with this story. But that was definitely one of them, that Mansell said the car was going to be as good as it was going to go, as good as it looked, and I think that was probably the case, really.
Yeah, I mean, they've always said, haven't they, that an ugly car can become good looking if it's fast, but there was none of that with this one. And at the first test, it becomes clear very quickly that this is a bad car. Mansell says it was dreadful from the first time he drove it, and it quickly became apparent to him that there was going to be no World Championship challenge in '95. But he explained in really good detail, as you hinted at, Sam, why this car was particularly incompatible with his driving style. And he said, "I need a car with which I can go deeply on the brakes, and when I turn the steering wheel, it will react immediately and go where I point it. Sadly, the McLaren couldn't do this at all. I couldn't trust the car, and I certainly couldn't drive it on the limit. If I tried to go 10/10ths, the chances of having an accident were very high. It was more sympathetic to drivers who like understeer and who, once they turn the steering wheel, allow the car plenty of time to turn. Everything I was asking from the car, it wasn't able to deliver. You know straight away when you're in a bad car. And the media latches on to the MP410 being a bad car very quickly. It's reported that it's an aerodynamic problem, so everyone's focusing on that mid-wing, the big engine cover. And rumours start then that they're going to get rid of it for the first race in Brazil. But actually, they raced with it until mid-season before they ran a conventional engine cover. Mansell, recalling that test, because he didn't talk at the time, says that he went off on his first lap because the car just jumped and swapped ends on him for no reason. And he came back to the pits and told the team it must have been his mistake. But he went back out again, and in his words, the car was all over the place. And his explanation was, sometimes the front end would have maximum grip and the rear would have no grip, then suddenly it would be the other way around. You had a massive swing from understeer to oversteer in the middle of the corner. Clearly the car was highly unbalanced aerodynamically, and that showed on the stopwatch. I was hugely disappointed by that first test, and I could see already that it was going to be a long uphill battle. Now, even today, Jack, we go to F1 tests, the new cars run for the first time, and the drivers always tell us it's too early to tell if they've got a good car or not. Then they retire from driving, and if you talk to them and you ask for an honest answer, they'll say they can tell usually within, 5 to 10 laps. So can we say that Mansell's not just looking back with hindsight, it's utterly believable that he would have driven this car and been able to tell immediately that it was a bit of a dog?
Yeah, I think he probably could. He probably could tell pretty quickly that the car wasn't where it needed to be, especially as the whole rhetoric, as we've already discussed, was that they were going to fight for the championship this year. And I think, having driven the Williams so soon before that, I think he must have had a good idea that car wasn't going to be where it needed to be. But for me, it just shows, also from Mansell, it just shows a complete lack of adaptation, because as I'm sure we'll go on to talk about, a lot of the blame Mansell rested on where McLaren was as an organisation and where it was with its its development team and stuff like that. But there's no acceptance from Mansell that he needs to adapt his driving style to how this car performs. It's all this doesn't suit the way I like to drive the car. I think he does recall in his book that he kind of admits that Hakkinen had a bit more. He states that Hakkinen had a bit more time to adapt his style to the car. But for me, there's, I've not seen any point in Mansell's book or heard him at any point say, this is my style. It's not really suited to this car, and I need to adapt to get the best out of the car. It's all geared towards McLaren haven't given me the car I need. It's not the style I want. Everything's not where I need it to be to perform, and therefore the car's rubbish. For me, it says a lot about Mansell's approach to the year based on just some of the things that he recalls in his book there about how he went about the season, because Hakkinen, again, I'm sure we'll go on to discuss, Hakkinen didn't have a stellar season in the car, but did manage to get some results out of the car. And, I think for me, it says a lot about Mansell's approach to the season, how he reflects on that test.
And it gets worse for McLaren very quickly, because Mansell says that not only did they realise they had a bad car, but they had no idea how to fix it. And he says, I knew the chances of us rectifying the problems in the short term were remote. What I found to my dismay was that some of the people in McLaren hadn't got a clue about what to do about the problems. This is what really knocked my confidence in the McLaren organisation. They didn't have a quick fix, and although the will was there, the savvy to get it done quickly and properly was not. I could see that until they put some new blood into the team and new direction into the design department, they would be in trouble for some time to come. Now, Sam, we know that not long after this, McLaren would solve those design problems by hiring Adrian Newey. That's a pretty good fix if you can get your hands on him. And they did start winning races, or they won a race just before he joined in the middle of '97. But do we think Mansell's appreciation of where McLaren was technically at this point was fair? I mean, this is a bad car. But was McLaren perhaps as bad behind the scenes as he's making out? Because they started to turn it around in '96, didn't they?
Yeah, I think the foundations were pretty solid. I mean, we're talking about guys like Neil Oatley, Henri Durand here, who were proven as designers, and Durand was the aerodynamicist. They also had, don't forget, Mario Ilian and Paul Morgan on the engineering side as well. So that they had the right people there, and obviously whether Adrian Newey came and just formed that to his own accord, that's kind of likely that took place. But I think I think Mansell in his book is probably overly harsh. I mean, Mansell had a track record in trying to find excuses that really didn't revolve around him. I mean, he that was just the character that he was. I think from when you look at what McLaren tried to do in '95, they tried pretty much everything. I think they had a B and a C version of the car, multiple specs. There was a major engine upgrade at Silverstone that they brought. That admittedly they had 2 engine failures at Hockenheim, but it's easy to forget that this was Mercedes' first year in Formula One, and actually McLaren only got the architecture or the parameters, the dimensions of the engine in late October '94, which it's a pretty short time frame to get everything up and running to that extent. So, I think in terms of the technical team, they had a good committee there. They probably just needed a leader. They'd had Gordon Murray, John Barnard, Gordon Murray, Steve Nichols, and then there was this period where it was more of a committee. And who knows to what extent that played a part in these difficult years for them. But I think ultimately McLaren was probably geared up and structured to have a leader, not a dictator, a leader, and I think that's what we saw from '97 onwards when Newey joined.
Well, we've managed to get this far into a discussion about Mansell and McLaren without talking about the most memorable detail of the story, which is that he didn't really fit in the car. This story breaks in March of 1995, so just on the eve of the season. And in fairness, the car wasn't designed with Mansell's size in mind, and it was too tight for him around the hips and the elbows, and his driving style relied a lot on upper body strength, a kind of elbows out style where you're driving through your shoulders, that kind of thing. And Mansell says he was so uncomfortable that he couldn't do more than 3 or 4 laps at a time. And in response to rumours that he was unable to drive it because he was disillusioned about how bad the car was, he tells McLaren and Mercedes that even if the car was competitive, he'd not be able to drive it. Now, obviously, over time, we've been able to look back on this one and make jokes about Mansell just being too chunky for the car. But driver comfort was an issue up and down the grid in '95 due to new regulations that were coming in. New levels of clearance were required between the steering wheel and the edge of the cockpit, around the driver's hands, that sort of area. So that pushed the wheel back towards the driver. And the chassis was no longer allowed to flare out below the cockpit opening to give drivers more room. McLaren had to make adjustments for Hakkinen to fit in it, but there wasn't enough room for those adjustments to help Mansell, who had a bigger frame. And even at Ferrari, it emerged that they'd been cutting out parts of the drivers' seats around the sides to give them more room. As I mentioned, Mansell didn't talk to the media at that first test, which I think if you were in the media pack at the time, that would tell you everything you needed to know. Hakkinen spoke to the press and he said, "Driving this car is like running the London Marathon in a pair of shoes that are too small. Mansell has suffered from bruising on his hands and arms, and if it is bad for me, it must be much worse for him." BBC News jump on this and they do a report where they ask McLaren, why has this issue only just come to light? And the team defends itself by saying that in seat fittings, and I think, Sam, you can tell us a bit more about this in a bit, but Mansell seemed to have enough room when he was sat in a static car in the factory, and it only became clear how compromised he was once he started driving it. It's then announced that Mansell will miss the first 2 races so McLaren can build a bigger chassis. And Mansell says it was a joint decision, and actually, in retrospect, he has praised Ron for the way Ron kind of took the embarrassment on the chin. And when he got to Brazil, Dennis said, "This is our problem, not Nigel's, and before you can expect a driver to give you good results, you have to make sure he's comfortable in the car." Now, Mansell was replaced for those first couple of races by Mark Blundell, and Mark very recently did an official F1 podcast interview with Tom Clarkson, Beyond the Grid. You should check it out. He talked a lot about his time at McLaren, but didn't necessarily talk about what was going on at the start of the year when he got called up to fill in for Nigel. So, Sam, you got hold of Mark and you had a chat about that period of his time at McLaren. So let's listen to what Mark told you and then we'll come back to this story.
But that stage, I had no understanding or vision in what was going to happen there. And and I think, to be fair, most of the people involved at that level at McLaren didn't have any understanding what was going to roll out either, because if you looked on paper, it kind of looked like the dream team.
And when you heard about Nigel's issues, was it a certainty you were going to get in there? Do you remember the conversation you had with Ron, Mark, about just prior to Interlagos when you headed out there with Mika?
Well, it's actually it was Martin Whitmarsh who gave me the call, and it was a weekend actually, and I was told to go to the factory. It was on a Sunday, and get myself into a car and get a seat fit done. And I thought, well, this is all a little bit strange, but I didn't really kind of like think anything of it, because F1 never stops. It's kind of 24/7, and you just get on and do what you're doing, But I was told to also park my car around the back, because nobody wanted me sort of parking around the front entrance. So I also thought that was slightly strange as well. But maybe it was a bit revealing, because I've got like a private plate on my car, which made it a bit obvious. But it was a little bit bizarre, because I actually bumped into Nigel in the corridor in the factory, which I don't think was supposed to have happened. I don't think that was the ideal plan. But anyway, lo and behold, I think that was maybe the day that he was informed that things were going to be not going any further forward in the immediate future, and I was being shoehorned in the car to take the seat.
When you think of McLaren and Mansell as a partnership, it's not one that sort of sits comfortably, is it? It was almost destined not to work in a way. Is that sort of fair to say?
It didn't make a lot of sense to me when they signed him, because I just didn't see that the personalities there were ever going to sort of gel. In saying that, personalities in Formula One don't really come into it in many ways, because it's all about delivery and it's all about getting the job done. And I think everyone perseveres and just gets their head down, because if they're getting results, then they grind it out. But it was a lot of razzmatazz and a lot of fanfare. And as I say, on paper, it looked very much like the dream team. But consequently, we had a situation where, I think in McLaren's history up to that date, it's probably one of the worst cards that ever been taken off the drawing board.
I mean, you did that first race, Mark, and got a point on the car's debut, and then Nigel came in for those two sort of cameo performances, which didn't work out. Just give us a feel for the car itself. Cars back then, I don't think people really appreciate how tight ergonomically the cars were back then. I mean, when you first sat in it, did you think it was tighter than previous cockpits that you'd raced in?
I think if you actually look back, a couple of areas. So one, although I was in good shape, I was always one of the heavier drivers, because it's just my natural sort of bone structure is what it is, and also for an F1 driver, I've always quite big shoulders. So it was always a little bit of a tight fit for me anyway, in whatever race car I drove in, especially a single-seater. I think, and I remember always looking at the scales and stuff, and I think Nigel was up there on that side of things. And Nigel was as F1 drivers go, was also one of the bigger set guys as well. I think, it's just differences in maybe style of driving, differences in the way that you feel comfortable and confident, and I don't think that cockpit and that car just suited him. That's where I got to in my assessment of it. And I think also at the end of the day, you got to understand that we were at different stages of career. This is a world champion that was sitting in there and needed things that he felt were right for him, and a guy that was in my shoes that was quite prepared to go and do what they had to do, whatever the case may be. So,
yeah.
And I know also from my Williams days, I mean, Nigel, for example, would, you'd drive with a steering wheel that was, far smaller than anybody else. But he had the physical strength to actually turn the wheel and, take that for a Grand Prix distance. And get out the other end. And even I'm not weak in that department, but I don't think even I could have managed to have done what he did.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I never really, and again, just being open, I never really delved too much into the politics of it, the reasoning behind it, and actually fundamentally didn't really concern myself with it. I don't know what his expectations were. I don't know what was positioned and promised for him, and maybe those things didn't align. I have no idea whatsoever. But, as I say, for me, I didn't really even consider or think about it because I only looked at it in the way that, right, there's my platform. Now I need to go and do what I need to do.
So Mansell said previously that even if the car was competitive, he couldn't have fit in it. Now, Sam, you've written a specific feature all about this whole saga of him not being able to fit into the car. So two things, really. Do you believe that Mansell would have refused to drive it if it was really quick? And as we mentioned with the BBC report earlier, how can McLaren get to the eve of the season before realising their star driver doesn't fit in their tub?
Yeah, I mean, it was another angle of this whole mess, wasn't it? The fact that they'd done the seat fitting and Mansell seemed to be, I mean, he was snug in the cockpit, that's for sure. For those who don't know, the seats are made for individual drivers using two-part foam, and once the seat had set and been trimmed, Mansell. These are the words of Colin Morgan, the mechanic who was working on that car and for the team that season, and he said that at the seat fitting, although it was tight, there was no protestation from Mansell about how he could drive the car. And then he did the test, and obviously with the forces involved and with the loadings, it became increasingly difficult for him to actually get the lock on the car when he was when the lack of front grip was kicking in, as it did lap by lap seemingly in that car. But yeah, I mean, could he have driven it if it was a quicker car? It's a complex one. Don't forget, as I sort of touched on, that that Mansell just didn't seem to want to go again. One of the telling things that Colin said actually was that when he came through the factory doors for the first time, his just overall demeanour was very dour. He looked demotivated. It was as if he didn't want to be there, and McLaren didn't want him to be there either. There wasn't much love on either side. Obviously, there were third parties involved in getting him into the team, which was probably, as is known now, Marlborough and a little bit of Bernie as well. Don't forget that Formula One, in a post-Senna and post-Prost world, needed champions, and Mansell was a reigning champion. So, but I think the desire just wasn't there, to be honest. He didn't have the motivation to do it, which is why I think he just didn't get any sympathy from the mechanics as well. I think the curiosity about Mansell was that for all his brio and bulldog spirit, which was undoubtedly there, we've seen the evidence. Mexico 90, Hungary 89, those glory, or that glory year with Ferrari. But then there's the flip side, isn't there? There is the side where Mansell just gave up. I mean, for all the tropes of Mansell, people seem to conveniently forget that in 1990 he actually parked healthy cars twice, once at Hockenheim and once at Spa. He alluded to damaged cars or what have you, but ultimately the team said that he could have continued. So I don't know. I mean, Schumacher in 2010, you could say, was a similar scenario. Some different circumstances, obviously, similar ages. Schumacher, a six-time champion. Mansell was a champion as well. They were there. Well, Schumacher was there to build a team up. He did that. Mansell just didn't have the wherewithal or the motivation to do that, and ultimately that told. Whether it was a competitive car or not, the fact is that Mansell just didn't have the inclination to dig in and do what he was, oddly, what he was noted for, which was for being a fighter.
Yeah, and you've got to think that he couldn't get over the sort of disillusionment of losing out on the Williams drive. What do you reckon, Jack? Do you think if the McLaren was rapid in testing, he'd have put up with the bumps and bruises?
It's a difficult one, isn't it? I think Sam's covered the point very nicely there. To be honest, that the motivation is the key factor in everything here. And even if the car was semi-competitive, would Nigel have found another way to wriggle out of this one, or to find a way to become disillusioned with it because that was just the point he was at in this deal? I mean, it's a difficult one. There's obviously talk about the contract extension and stuff like that he could have been there for an extra 2 years and stuff like that. So when these talks are going on, there was obviously some thought about the future and looking to build something here. But I think there's looking back, you can only assume that there was a point where Mansell became so disillusioned with the performance of the car that he'd been given, and it was clear that he expected to fight for a championship and prove Williams wrong for not picking him up for that year, and obviously that wasn't going to be the case. So I think there must have been a point where Mansell had decided that that wasn't going to happen, and that the situation wasn't tenable for him because he wasn't being given what he was told that he was going to be given, which was a championship winning car, or the opportunity to win a championship. And his assessment of the team at that point shows that Mansell didn't believe that McLaren were ready to turn that round anytime soon. So obviously Mansell couldn't have seen that Adrian knew he was going to come in and do so much good work with that team in the future. But at that point, Mansell would have been pretty old at that point, and probably not the right person to be leading the team at that point as a driver. So it's as is the case with this, hindsight's a beautiful thing where you can drop yourself into particular points in time and try and work out exactly what was going on. But I think Mansell did approach this and convinced himself that this was a good deal for him and that he could fight for the championship and that McLaren was going to be a good move. And I think after that first test, I think he found out very quickly that the car wasn't where it needed to be, the team wasn't to his liking, and that he was going to have to do a lot of adapting to that situation that he wasn't really willing to do at that point in his career.
Hindsight's a wonderful thing. That's one of the rejected names for this podcast, I think. Blundell and Hakkinen, the car's off the pace, but they managed to score points at the start of the season. But even Blundell reports bruising on his elbows and wrists. So as he mentioned in that little clip with Sam, it was a tight squeeze for him as well. The bigger car is ready for Imola round 3. And Dennis is promising to wipe the smiles off the faces of those who have enjoyed the team starting the year on the back foot. Mansell won't get to drive the car for the first time until practice. He does over 100 laps in a test with the original chassis at Silverstone, but he can only drive it because the team have removed some side impact panels from the cockpit, so the car couldn't legally race in that state. Ron then jokes that the new car has enough room for a stereo, and Mansell plays down his chances of being on the pace immediately. And recalling it in his book, he says when he drove the bigger car for the first time, he was dismayed at how it felt, because aside from having more room, it had all the same handling problems of the original. He qualified 9th and finished 10th, 2 laps down, and he said, "We were not competing, we were just making the numbers up. There was no way this package could be considered a challenger for the championship." Now, Sam, is that a bit naive of Mansell to think that he was going to get the bigger car, but it was also going to solve all of the other handling problems? If anything, the time they had to spend making a bigger monocoque for him was time that couldn't be spent solving the aero problems.
Correct. Yeah. People forget that the Formula One teams were an awful lot smaller in those days as well. It was probably around 300, I think, which is, a third of some of the bigger teams now almost. So, I think it was inevitable they would be a little stretched in ascertaining and then fighting the issues and then the development afterwards. So the delays plainly did affect things, but the facts are that McLaren were probably the best equipped team to try and claw that back as well. So there is a tiny little bit of sympathy for Mansell in that respect. And Ron Dennis had really promoted this aura of McLaren being able to achieve almost anything as well. So it was quite a long way to fall in a way. Don't forget that this was before a lot of simulator work was proficient in Formula One. They did a lot of real life testing, yes, but that takes a lot more time for rapid prototyping and there weren't advanced vehicle dynamic test rigs back then with sophisticated 7 post-track relays and all these things that Formula One teams kind of take for granted these days to make some sweeping changes. But I think probably as well, from a human resources point of view, they probably didn't use Blundell enough, or rather Ron maybe didn't manage him properly, should I say. I think, this is the guy who did a lot of testing for Williams. It was a highly prized test driver for them, and then McLaren also in 92. So actually, giving him a pretty paltry race-by-race deal on test driver money might not have been the smartest thing for, an esteemed manager like Ron Dennis to do, perhaps.
Yeah, let's move on to the Spanish Grand Prix because that's where this story comes to a head. Mansell qualifies only a 10th behind Hakkinen, but they're sharing the 5th row of the grid, and Dennis calls the team's performance inadequate. And Hakkinen had been between a second and 1.3 seconds off the pace at the first 3 races, but in Spain he's 2.3 seconds off Michael Schumacher, who's on pole. And Dennis says the long sweeping nature of the corners at Barcelona highlighted the weaknesses of the MP410. And in the race, after 18 laps, Mansell parks the car, declaring it undrivable. And all Ron said at the time was that Mansell chose not to continue. And Mansell was aware at the time that the team didn't agree with his decision to stop. Now, Mansell said, at the time he said he had problems with the car's balance from the start of the race, saying it was oversteering a lot to begin with, then understeering, but at that point it was drivable. Then a couple of laps after his first pit stop, it was understeering so much that it became impossible to drive in the faster corners. In his book, he looked back on this saying, you can't go storming into a corner then have nothing happen when you turn the wheel. I made a lot of alterations to the car, but they didn't make it any better. They merely delayed one problem and created another. I was fighting the car all the way around, and I was lucky if I was lucky, I might be able to get 10th on the grid, and that would be a good result. I couldn't believe that things were so bad. And he continues, when you're driving a car that isn't working and you drive it into a corner and it understeers straight off the track heading for a brick wall, answers on a postcard if you can tell us where the brick walls are at the circuit Barcelona, Catalunya, and nothing you do makes any difference, then that's pretty stupid. I'm not going to drive any car, no matter how illustrious the team is, that is downright dangerous. Sitting in the cockpit, I had no idea what was wrong with it, whether the front wing was broken, whether there was something wrong with the front suspension, or if I'd picked up debris underneath the car. I knew that it didn't feel correct, and so I had to retire it. Anybody who criticises a driver for using his intelligence and retiring an undrivable car is being unreasonable. So, Sam, would you care to be unreasonable and comment on that?
I'm surprised that Ron Dennis didn't pulp all those books when it came out. Yeah, I think some context, really. I think if someone's commanding £7 to £8 million back in 1995 as a pay packet, and yes, they're a world champion, at the very least, they need to dig in and they need to start supporting the team. They need to start leading the team. I mean, Mansell never even came close to doing that. Ultimately, it was, if anyone did, it was Mika Hakkinen and Mark Blundell. And I'm pretty sure, well, I know that the mechanics attest to that because we spoke to Colin Morgan, as we said, and that's very much his opinion as well. But, I think the motivation question comes back again. At Barcelona, he was at one stage after his pit stop, he was fighting for 15th place with Domenico Ciattarella, if I've pronounced that right, which I probably haven't. Which, in a Simtac, can you imagine the frame of mind that a driver of Mansell's confidence and standing that put him in? I mean, it must have been difficult. Of course it was, but again, coming back to it, he was the star driver, and he was part of his remit was to drive that team and use his experience. I mean, again, from a mechanic's anecdote about that, he was moaning on the radio for most of that race, and it was an open channel at that time. And the radio protocol of McLaren changed after that race because of Mansell's persistent moaning, in words of the mechanics. I mean, that just isn't befitting of a world champion, really, is it? And you can imagine the thoughts of the mechanics who will have been working in 20-hour days to get this car ready for him and redoing and relaminating a new cockpit and so forth. So ultimately, it just it was all brought to a head, and it was probably just a mercy for both parties that it ended the way it did, unfortunately.
I think Mansell's career is, I think you have to look back as well to understand how we got to this point as well, because he spent so long being that working class hero who was fighting against the odds and fighting against every car he had to make it competitive. We all have this image of Mansell being, a proper working class hero who would drag the car around the track, even if it wasn't competitive, to make sure he was getting the result, and he was going to beat his teammate, and he was going to do everything he could to finally win that Formula One World Championship that he'd wanted for so long. And once he got it, everything sort of fell perfectly into place for him. 92, everything was absolute, couldn't have been a more perfect situation for him. 93, he went to America and people asked him why he was doing it, and he dominated out there and won that championship. Everything had gone so well for Mansell for a few years, and I think coming into this McLaren situation, he'd been sold on Dennis, saying that the car was going to be immediately competitive, and this was going to be his chance to put another one over on Williams and say, you should have chose me for 95, but you didn't, and I'm going to beat you in a McLaren instead. The ultimate sort of, the ultimate fingers up, if you like. And obviously immediately it was clear that wasn't going to happen, and I think that led to the massive swing of Mansell's mood from the whole, we're going to fight for the championship, to this massive amount of demotivation that was seen by people within McLaren, pretty much as soon as that first test had happened.
Yeah, and by this point, Mansell is being affected by what's going on, and he admitted afterwards that he was doing some soul searching after that Spanish Grand Prix, because he was aware people were saying he'd given up and was just there for the money. And he says, yes, the contract was very lucrative, but he didn't want to be known as a journeyman driver just hanging around to be paid millions of pounds to drive at the bottom half of the top 10. So after Spain, he said he had to look himself in the mirror and ask if he was prepared to drive this car on a knife edge. And as you mentioned there, Jack, things had gone pretty well over the previous couple of years, but he said he'd given up that life in America and his IndyCar contract to come back to F1 with Williams, not McLaren. And he'd come back because he thought it was a foregone conclusion he'd get that Williams drive. But now here he was driving a McLaren that wasn't very good and was going to take a while to sort. And in fairness, in the first 5 races of the year, McLaren were on average 1.5 seconds off pole. And in the final 5 races of the year, they were 1.7 off pole on average. So they didn't, as much as they did to this car, they didn't make it that much better. And after the Spanish Grand Prix, Mansell and Dennis have a meeting, and it's agreed at Nigel's request that he should stand down. He says the parting was amicable and both sides regretted how badly it had turned out. When McLaren announced the news, Dennis says the MP410 has not met the expectations of both parties. Mansell has not felt confident with the car, which has affected his ability to commit fully to the programme. Ron does praise Nigel for being entirely straightforward and totally professional in his business conduct, which is definitely a real Ron Dennis quote. Mansell says in that announcement he expected on joining McLaren that the total package would have given me the possibility to be competitive with the other top teams. He does say that McLaren is undoubtedly building a future which I'm sure will be successful in the long term. And with that he was right, because in 98 they win the championship. And Ron says to the media, I think this is when they get to Monaco maybe, unless you can give 100% all of the time, irrespective of any set of circumstances, then you are not being a team player and not being honest with yourself. And he said that came up in discussions with Mansell and led to both sides agreeing it was best to stop the relationship. Bernie Eccleston chimes in. Sam, you mentioned that Bernie probably played a part in the deal coming together in the first place, and he said that he's surprised Mansell gave up so easily, and he puts it down to personal differences between Mansell and Dennis, which they both denied. And he says but he also said there was nothing good about having Mansell back in F1 this time around because he wasn't his usual self. We've talked about Mansell's motivation, Jack, and his demeanour came up a lot in coverage at the time. There were a couple of theories saying that either he was too relaxed or he just wasn't taking it seriously enough. But Frank Williams had a theory that Mansell had mellowed while living in America and that Williams had noticed this in 94. So do you think Mansell was mellow, or are we going to stick to our theory that you've both mentioned that the fire had gone out by this point?
I think there's an element of mellowing out, and I think part of that comes down to finally winning that championship in 92 and then taking America by storm as well. And so much of what drove Nigel before 92 was trying to win that championship, and it was an obsession almost for Mansell to win that championship. And once he had won it, I think it was only natural that there was going to be a certain element of mellowing out. And with some drivers, there needs to be a kind of recalibration of what's next. Some drivers naturally go on to, right, I've won one championship, time to win the next one. I'm going to win 7, I'm going to win 8. with some drivers, it's a bit more difficult because they spend so long trying to reach that one goal, and when they do reach it, it's a little bit of a sometimes it takes some inward reflection to work out what to do next and how to go about that. And obviously Mansell's approach was to go to a different country and take on a different championship, so that was a massive recalibration for Mansell in that sense. He didn't go about it in the normal way as most drivers probably would have, staying with the same team and going for the championship again. Obviously that wasn't an option, but I think there was definitely an element of him mellowing out because of that title success, and then having such an easy life in America, in terms of the lifestyle out there and how the IndyCar circus kind of worked at that point. But I still think there was I still think the motivation issue is what we've discussed previously is the overriding factor here, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk about the eventual parting of ways. But I think the motivation factor is a big one, but also I can't help but feel a little bit sorry for him in a certain sense. I mean, he did need to step up and lead that team. He did need to do so much a better job of adapting to that car and dragging it around the track like we become so familiar of seeing Nigel do. But at the same time, maybe it was him being naive for sort of buying into that talk of Dennis wanting to win the championship that year and thinking the car was going to be there. But I can't help but feel like he was sold a bit of a limp duck at that point, and it was another one of Nigel's unlucky transfer moves that we've seen over his career. But I think in answer to the question, I think there was an element of mellowing out because of those successes that he'd had in the previous years. But at the same time, I don't think that motivation was there like it had been previously before that championship success.
I think actually when you look back at Mansell's '94 kart season, and I recall speaking to some of the Lola engineers that were working with him at Newman Haas that season. I think there are signs that the fire had gone out after he'd won that title in '93. But then the great contradiction of Mansell comes back, doesn't it? Because he has this really desperate season in '94, and by all accounts, as the engineers attested, gave up really during that season. But then the great contradiction comes on board when he does those cameo performances with Williams, and I think it was Magny-Cours, Jerez and Suzuka in Adelaide, wasn't it? And he had that terrific battle with Alesi at Suzuka, and then gets the pole at Adelaide, beating the championship protagonist. So he was just a seesaw of everything, and it depended on which way it came down. And in '95, I think only he just decided that this is not something I want to be a part of, and the demotivation told in the end.
Yeah. Now, Ron Dennis, as I said, he and Mansell denied that there was any problem with the personal relationship, and Ron, when he was asked about that, said the relationship was much better than I could have hoped for. We had no problems, and it had no relevance to the decision both sides took to cease the relationship. I could read out Ron Dennis quotes all day. They're absolutely brilliant. But the announcement at the time seemed to leave the door open for Mansell to potentially come back. And when Ron was asked about that, he said it wasn't accidental wording in the press release. And that prompts some speculation that Mansell could return, perhaps even for the British Grand Prix. But nothing comes of it. And Ron says, if he would come back, maybe it'd be for '96. But we know that David Coulthard's coming in then. So the Spanish Grand Prix is Nigel Mansell's final appearance in F1. Now, it's been said many times that if he'd bowed out after that win in Australia for Williams, that would have been the perfect way to end the career. And it's such a shame that he tacked on these two rubbish appearances with McLaren. But Jack and Sam, based on everything we've been through there, you can both chime in on this one. We'll start with you, Sam. Looking at how it went over the short period McLaren and Mansell were together, was it the right decision to just cut all the ties and end the relationship when they did?
Absolutely, 100% sure about that. And I think both parties would probably concur now, 25 years on. I think the fact that it was based in, non-sporting attractions, i.e. that it was a showbiz deal, wasn't it? It was Marlborough and Bernie placing Mansell with McLaren in this kind of audacious, and going back to the start, surreal partnership. And I just think there seemed to be, even though it was difficult for McLaren, from a team perspective, having spoken to some of the team members, it was just a relief. The sense was relief that this had stopped, both for Mansell, because he plainly didn't want to be there, really, and for McLaren, because it just didn't fit. It was proper square peg round hole stuff, and there was no way in hell that thing was going to work. And I think just cutting their losses, it cost McLaren or maybe Marlboro quite a bit of money, but I think for everybody it was just an enormous relief in the end.
Yeah, definitely think that was the right move. Couldn't agree more with you there, Sam. 100% is definitely the right number there. I think, initially McLaren should have gone with a younger, more motivated driver, maybe someone like Blundell, or at least someone sort of at that midpoint of their career where they had a bit of experience leading a team and developing a car.
Or kept Martin Brundle.
Yeah, or kept Martin Brundle. That might have been a sensible option as well, Glenn. I didn't know that one was on the table. But I think
we can do whatever we want here. It's fine.
Brilliant. I like that. We can have some fun with this one then. But yeah, I think I've spoken to Gary Anderson about this on numerous occasions, and he loved working with younger drivers in developing cars. Obviously, the experience element isn't always there, but you're getting a motivated driver who's there to further their career. And Gary said that he'd take a younger driver over that sort of higher paid, more experienced driver 9 times out of 10 and sometimes 10 times out of 10. And I think that showed in this situation that it was the wrong move from the start for McLaren. With Mansell, I think he definitely made the right decision to finish when he did. Those who will have said he should have given it the season and should have tried to battle it out obviously didn't see him fighting with those Simtecs. And obviously Nigel was being paid a lot of money to be there, and with that should come a certain level of performance, and Nigel wasn't delivering that. But it's not like they put someone else in and they suddenly moved 5 or 6 places up the grid. The problems were still there. So I think for Mansell it was a good move, because it didn't, although it did do a lot of damage to his legacy, it could have been worse if he'd spent the rest of the season fighting with those teams at the back of the grid and miles behind Mika Hakkinen. So I think it's a shame this whole thing happened in the first place, but the point where the two parted seems like, to me, the right decision on both counts.
Yeah, there was no need to throw good money after bad and good time after bad probably as well. And I have to say, we managed to get a mention of Sciattarella and a Simtech into this episode, so not all is lost. But that's the end of Nigel Mansell's F1 career, and it's also the end of our episode. So remember to get in touch with @WeAreTheRace on social media with your questions and comments for our series finale, where you can ask us anything about F1 from 1989 to 2005 using the hashtag BringBackV10s. We've got something very quirky for you next week, where teams like Simtech would get a mention if they'd been around at the time. We'll be taking a look back at the madness of F1's pre-qualifying era, when sometimes we had almost 40 cars trying to get onto the grid for a given weekend. If you're a fan of rubbish F1 teams, that is an episode for you, and we will see you next week to talk about it.